Welcome back to 8th grade social studies. This is week 4, and we've got a very interesting week for you today. Today we are going to be talking, continuing our conversation actually, on medieval Europe. But today we're going to be talking about some very interesting things. First of all, we're going to be talking about feudalism. How did the people live and where did they live? And what were the social rankings of people? And then we're going to be talking about the role of the Christian, specifically the Catholic Church in medieval Europe. And then we're going to look at the power struggle between kings and popes and how that affected life in Europe. And last but not least, we're going to be talking about one of the most frightening things that's ever happened in the history of the world, and that is the Black Plague. So, without further ado, let's get started. The first thing we want to do is remind ourselves where we were last week. Last week we were talking about the Muslims and the Magyars and the Vikings and the fact that they were coming in and that they were raiding and invading all different parts of Europe. And then we had the Frankish kings. We had Clovis and Charlemagne who were trying to defend their territory. And we had kings that actually couldn't protect their land because these invaders were very, very harsh and very, very strong. So they needed to come up with something in order to be able to organize their world and their people so that they could protect Europe. So that begins feudalism. Feudalism is defined as a medieval European political, economic, and social structure that existed from the 9th century to about the 15th century. And it is the way that the society organized themselves. It started as a system of promises. Everyone needed something in this relationship. They needed to give, they needed to get, and then they needed to give again and get again. So it was all about a give and take. Well, the major thing that was given in that give and take was land. Land was the most important commodity during medieval Europe. The land at that time was actually called a fief. So you actually gave a fief to the person that you wanted to be loyal to you. So all the land in the kingdom technically belonged to the king. And the king, however, was unable to rule all of that land himself. So what he did is he turned some of that land over to his nobles. And then the nobles had the responsibility to take care of that land and do something with it. And they also needed someone to be loyal to them because all this fighting is going on. Who is going to come in and help them fight? Well, in order to encourage those people to fight for them, they would actually give them land. And so that brought this relationship on who is going to serve who and what are they going to do for each other. So you have nobles that are going to give fiefs to people called knights. The lord is actually going to be the person who gives the fief. If you gave land to someone, you automatically became their lord, and they became your vassal. So the lord was greater than the vassal. But what did this formula bring you? It brought you something called allegiance. These people were going to be loyal to you because you gave them land to live on. So if you gave the land, you were a lord. If you received the land, you were a vassal. This relationship formed this allegiance. I give to you, you give to me. The duties of the lords and vassals, there were very close ties between the lords and the vassals, different things that they were responsible for doing. The lords had to send help and supplies and provide things for the vassals. The vassals in return had to fight for and protect their lords. It was all about a working relationship between the different levels, lords and vassals. Okay. Now this brings about a complex social structure. If you see our social structure here on our PowerPoint, you're going to notice there's a lot of stuff going on here. First of all, you have the king at the top, the king, the royal family, the princesses and the princes, and they're all vying for that top portion of rule. And they're the ones that primarily controlled all of Europe and all of its land. But then they would give some of their land to different lords and vassals that were in the nobility. Those lords and vassals would in turn give it to the knights. And the knights would in turn let the farmers and the peasants and the serfs work the land. But if you notice, there are lots of arrows going up and down here. It was a very complex relationship because everybody had responsibilities to people above them, people below them and people around them. So it was a give and take relationship, but it worked in Europe. At the time of medieval times, feudalism was something that worked because you had a large population of people and everybody had their responsibilities. The thing is, if you were born into a certain class, that's the class you were in for your life. Very, very rarely did someone who was in a class move up or down in class. Your class determined who you married, what kind of work you did, how much money you were paid. Everything was determined by what layer of this complex feudal system that you were on. So working hard rarely changed your status, but you were expected to perform whatever duties were in your particular level. That's the only way that this would work, is if everybody did what they were supposed to do. So again, your clothing, your food, your marriage, your home, everything was determined for you by the people above you that you served. Now that brings us to one of the most important levels of this social structure, and that is the knight. When we think of medieval times, many times we think about the knights of the Round Table, and chivalry and how they behaved. Well, the easiest way to become a knight was to actually be the son of a noble. So you kind of had to start at the top of the food chain. You had to start by being a noble. At about the age of 7 years old, they would take you from your home and they would put you into another home, and in that home would be living a knight. And that knight, you would become the page for that knight. So at about 7 years old, you started your training to become a knight. You spent your time becoming strong, learning how to ride, learning weaponry, learning how to read, how to speak languages. You learned all of these things so that you could be a good knight. Believe it or not, they even learned how to dance, because who wants a knight that can't show well in court? Because it was very important that you were respectful, but you had to be respected as well. And being educated was one of the greatest ways to be respected. So even though knights were powerful warriors, they were also very well versed in the ways of life. Once you were about the age of 16, then you were given to a knight. And that knight was your final training ground. This is where you were going to do the duties for that knight. You helped that knight put on their armor. You helped keep their weapons clean. You took care of their horses. You made sure their meals were served properly. You were a servant to that knight, but it was done in an honorary way. You were there. If that knight was in battle, you were their second. You were the one that was there to make sure they had everything that they needed. So you were a squire to that knight. Squires also practiced wearing the heavy armor. The knight wanted you to be ready. When it was your turn to become a knight, that knight wanted you to be ready. So you learned to practice chivalry, and we'll talk a little bit more about chivalry in a couple of seconds, but I wanted to mention it here because the proper conduct of the knight was extremely important to the knight who was training you, because they were responsible for making sure you were going to be a good knight if you were going to be one. So chivalry, the ideal knight lived to serve their king and their country. You were totally dedicated to your king and your country no matter what. You had to avoid lying, cheating. You were very powerful, but you didn't improperly torture people. You believed in justice. Justice was the right way of doing things correctly to serve your king. Respect and honor women. That was extremely important, and that's where we get the word chivalry today. If a man is a gentleman, he is considered to be chivalrous, and that comes from the medieval times and the idea of chivalry. And you had to avenge wrong. So it was actually a 10 commandments of the Knight's Code. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, because the church and religion was very important during this time. You had to obey all the authority over you. You had to not commit injustices or do any kind of evil. You had to defend the weak. You had to speak the truth at all times, be generous, persevere. All of these are things that we would want people to be today, especially young men. We would want them to be chivalrous. So this is something maybe we could all learn to live by. Once you were finished with your training, then it was time for the dubbing ceremony. And what would happen during that time, you've probably seen this in movies, the knight-to-be would kneel down in front of their lord, and the lord would take a sword and touch ceremoniously the knight would dub them to be a knight. So from that point forward, you were loyal to that lord who had just dubbed you and made you a knight. And this is a couple of pictures of the dubbing ceremony. Then that brings us to the lower class. What was happening with the lower class? We had the kings and queens, we had the nobles, we had the knights, we had all that going on. But none of this would work without the people on the lower level. Of course, we had the farmers, the peasants, and people called serfs. The farmers were a bit better off than the peasants because they actually had their farms. They were actually vassals to some of the knights. The vassals would give them the lords would give them some of their land, and the farmers would become vassals. Peasants were the poorest people in the medieval time period, and they lived primarily in small villages and sometimes on the land of their vassal. The serfs were amongst those poorest people of the peasant class. So you had the poor peasants, and then you had the poorest of the poor, which were the serfs. Everyday farmers and peasants could move around, be educated, and marry if they could afford it. Serfs, on the other hand, could not do any of that without the permission of their lord. So they were almost like slaves, but during this particular time period, you could not purchase or sell or buy another person. So it wasn't slavery in that way. It was more slavery in being told what you could or could not do, because they could not sell each other during this particular time period. So serfs would pay the lord in the form of their labor. Your labor, you didn't get paid a wage. What you got in return for all your hard work was you got enough food to eat and hopefully some shelter over your head. So we've got this lower working class. And we're going to see something interesting that's going to happen for these people later on. That brings us to manor life. Where did people live? Now, most of us, when we think of homes for people during the medieval times, especially the queens and the kings and the nobility, we think of castles. Of course, castles existed, especially for the kings and the queens and the royalty. However, on a manor, there was usually a manor house, and there were also smaller dwellings for your vassals. There were dwellings for your farmers and your peasants. There were places to store all of the goods. You had your farmland, your pasture land for your animals. You had the mill where you took care of all the goods and you stored it. And it was actually a city in itself. Every manor was virtually a city in itself. And a manor would not be complete, of course, without the village church. So let's look at castles and manor houses. Most of us, when we think of medieval castles, we think of something that looks like this. And they did exist. There were quite a few of those, but most of the homes for the nobility looked more like this. They were known as manor houses, and they were very fortified structures that would protect the people that lived within them from the people from the outside. Castles, of course, we hear about them in fairy tales, and they're always the grandest, but not as many of those existed as we think. And actually, if you investigate castle life, you'll find out it's not quite as grand, because they could be very cold and dark places to live, but they were very well fortified, so they could protect you. Within the great halls of these manor houses and these castles, people would hold their manorial courts. They would have communal meals together. They would invite dignitaries to come in. And this is where a lot of decisions were made and great banquets were held in these castles and these manor houses. And then we've got the village churches all the way up to the grand cathedrals, because as I mentioned before, religion was extremely important to the people of the medieval times. Many of the churches were built in the Middle Ages in these smaller villages, and they would be small village churches very similar to this one. The biggest churches, however, were called cathedrals. Cathedrals were built to inspire awe, an awe for God, looking at this grand building. And they were always quite beautiful. Most cathedrals were built in this similar fashion. It was more of a Gothic type fashion. If you notice, they have the great pointed tops. That is the Gothic fashion. And they had very tall walls and high ceilings. And most of the greatest cathedrals were actually laid out in the shape of a cross. And of course, that had a symbolic meaning for the church. So let's switch to talking about the importance of Christianity in this particular time period. Most of the people who lived during this time in Europe were Christian, and the world revolved around the church and your weekly attendance to church. You were christened, confirmed, married, and buried at your church, so it was extremely important. The church was also very powerful. It was one of the most unifying elements of this particular time period, and people depended on the church. They paid high taxes to the church in order to keep it going. The clergy of the church went all the way from the Pope at the top to your cardinals, archbishops, all the way down to your monks, your nuns, and your friars that are at the bottom. So you had a hierarchy in the church as well. Some church clergy spent so much of their time, however, in politics that they forgot to serve the religious needs of the community. Most of the time, the religious needs were served by those monks and nuns and friars at the bottom, because these people up here were too worried about power. So speaking of that, who was in charge? Was the church in charge, or was the king in charge? Well, there was a lot of argument over that, and a lot of people had different ideas about that. Well, the Pope thought he was in charge, and the king thought he was in charge. A perfect example of that is the relationship between two men. One was Pope Gregory II, and the other one was King Henry IV. King Henry IV took it upon himself to appoint some church leaders, specifically a bishop. Well, the Pope got mad at that and said, no, you can't appoint those bishops. That's my job. Well, these two had you can read it up here, had a continual battle with each other over who had the responsibility and who had the power. Well, Henry became so angry with the Pope that he excommunicated him from the church. Excommunication was the worst thing that could happen to somebody during this time period, because that meant you couldn't go to heaven. So the Pope excommunicated King Henry. King Henry went and begged the Pope to not excommunicate him. He stood out in the snow for 3 days and begged the Pope, please let me back in the church. The Pope eventually did. You would think that would end their battle, but it didn't, because you can see down here, the Pope once again excommunicates Henry, and in the end, Henry deposes the Pope, and the Pope dies in exile. So you see, there's a lot of arguing going on between these popes and kings. So the people started thinking, wait a minute, what is happening here? I'm questioning the power. Who's actually in charge? And they actually started questioning the power of the church. And these people were called heretics. They said, the church isn't serving my needs anymore. The church is more worried about their own wealth and what's going on with them. They're not worried about teaching the words of Jesus Christ anymore. They're more worried about their power structure. So people became heretics. Well, heresy became a widespread thing. Anyone who was non-Catholic, that's Muslims and Jews, or anyone who went against the teachings of the church, was considered to be a heretic. Well, those heretics started being punished. This was called the Inquisition. There were inquisitions all over Europe. The Inquisition was a powerful way to torture and get people back in line with the teachings of the Catholic Church. One of the greatest inquisitions was the Spanish Inquisition. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain wanted everybody to be Catholic, and if you weren't, they had no problems torturing you in some very bizarre and awful ways. You see people hanging, people burning, drawn and quartered, whatever it took. They wanted to prove that the Catholic Church was in charge and you needed to serve the Catholic Church. But the world is going to change, because all of this power struggle, none of it's going to make a bit of difference when one of the most awful things in history occurs, and that is the Black Death. Now, we're going through a thing right now where we're going through something that many people have referred to as a plague, but it was nothing like the actual Black Death that occurred during this particular time period. It's a devastating global epidemic called the Bubonic Plague. It arrived in Europe in about 1347. 12 ships arrived into the port of Europe, and the people were excited the ships were coming in, but the excitement went away pretty quickly when they realized that pretty much the only living thing on those ships anymore were the rats, because the people on the ships were dead. And not only were they dead, they were gravely ill. They were covered in black boils that oozed blood, and it was just a disgusting way to die. And so the people at the harbor ordered those ships to be sent away, and they called them the death ships. But over the next 5 years, the Black Death would kill more than 20 million people in Europe alone. That's 1/3 of the continent's population. The Black Death was terrifyingly contagious. The mere touching of the clothes of someone that had it, you could get it. Think about how different that is than what we have now. And this disease was an ugly disease. I mean, it was like swelling and bleeding and diarrhea and vomiting and fever. It was horrible. So the people that were perfectly healthy during the day, the next morning could be dead from the plague. And they were carrying people and putting them in mass graves because it was like a human lasagna. They would put a layer of bodies, some dirt, another layer of bodies, some dirt, another layer, and some dirt, just to keep the bodies. The body count was horrible during this particular time. And you can read about how awful it is. We'll skip that for now. Changes. The Black Plague is going to bring changes to medieval Europe. The outbreak of the plague, people are going to question their religion. They don't know the exact cause of the plague, so they think they're being punished by God. It's a punishment. It's witchcraft. It's sorcery. People didn't make the right choices, so they're being punished. And the plague being so contagious, people tried to do everything they could in order to protect themselves from it. They killed heretics and bad people. They perceived the failure of God to answer these prayers, and so it splintered the community. People didn't know what to do because God wasn't helping them. And so the fall of the feudal system is going to happen because of all this. Before the plague, the feudal system rigidly divided the population into a caste system. But after the plague, when 1/3 of the people are dead, the feudal system is going to fall apart because you don't have everyone to serve on the different levels. And it's going to cause vast labor shortages. The land that had usually been the primary source of wealth was now worthless. The people in the cities felt like they had to escape, so many of them left the cities, especially the wealthy Christians. They fled this disease in massive numbers. You've probably heard the song Ring Around the Rosie. The people believed that it was bad air that was causing this, so they tried to make the air smell better. They burned smoke. They did whatever they could to fumigate you from this particular disease. None of it helped, by the way. And then, of course, we had medical knowledge. Medical knowledge is going to increase at this time. We're going to build hospitals for the first time, and we're going to try to help people, and doctors are going to become more prominent. And they're going to learn a lot from all those people that died of the Black Plague. And that's a very interesting thing, a good thing that came out of this particular thing. So what were the benefits of the plague? Healthier people. People could demand higher wages, and the working conditions would changed and became better. And all of this was very good for the people because now there were fewer people to vie for the good jobs, so you could almost, the middle class, that lower class we talked about earlier, now they could have a better life. It's a sad thing to say that so many people had to die so that other people could benefit, but that's exactly what happened. So the Black Plague was a horrible thing that occurred during the Middle Ages that brought a lot of changes to medieval Europe. And so if you do, I encourage you to do a little more research on the Black Plague and do some comparison between what is going on in our world today and what was happening with the Black Plague. And maybe you find it very interesting. I think I was talking over with some friends, and I think that if the disease that we're going through today was nearly as bad as the Black Plague was, I don't think you would have people worried about social distancing. I think you would definitely be doing a little bit more of that willingly if you saw what the Black Plague looked like. Sometimes it being invisible is a little bit better than it being something that you can actually see the horrendous parts of it. So that was a lot to cover today. I hope you go back and review this and look at it again, because there's a lot of stuff on the PowerPoint that you can, research and look into, and I hope that you do, because the changes that happened in Europe during the medieval times had a great effect on what's going on in our world today. Okay, so we're going to wrap up by talking about what are we going to be talking about for the next couple of weeks. We only have 2 weeks left, guys, so we're almost done, but we got a lot more interesting stuff to talk about. The Crusades, the Magna Carta, the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc, the Renaissance. Lots of art and the Reformation of the church, all of these great things that are going to be occurring during the Middle Ages. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.